The cathedral doors stood half open as if the building itself was hesitating to let the morning light inside. And in that thin line between shadow and brightness, every sound felt suspended like the world was holding its breath. Inside, rows of polished wooden pews stretched toward the front, where white lilies surrounded a closed casket, their soft scent mixing with the faint chill of stone walls. And above it all the stained glass filtered pale blue and gray light that made everything feel slower, heavier, almost unreal. People filled every seat, elegant black clothing blending into a single dark wave of mourning. Yet no one truly moved. No one dared to speak above a whisper, because this was not just a funeral, it was the kind of silence that comes when something unspoken is too large to ignore. At precisely 10:03 a.m., the side entrance opened again and Ethan Caldwell stepped inside, his presence immediately shifting the air, not with noise, but with attention, as if every eye in the room had been programmed to find him the moment he appeared. He wore a tailored black suit, understated but expensive in a way that did not ask for approval, his face composed in a stillness that suggested control rather than grief, and behind him 2 assistants remained near the door like shadows that knew their place. Ethan paused just long enough to scan the room, his gaze landing briefly on the casket, then moving forward without hesitation, each step measured, deliberate, as though even sorrow had to obey his schedule. Across the aisle near the front stood Sophie Lane, dressed in a black designer dress that looked more like confidence than mourning, her posture calm, almost elegant, her hands gently folded as if she belonged exactly where she was. And when her eyes met Ethan's, she did not look away, instead offering a faint, controlled smile that lingered just a second too long to be accidental. No one spoke it out loud, but the space between them filled instantly with questions that had no permission to be asked. And in the back rows, subtle movements began, heads turning slightly, whispers forming like smoke rising from a flame no one admitted to lighting. She shouldn't be here, someone murmured under their breath, while another voice tried to correct it with uncertainty. She was close to the family, I think, but neither explanation settled anything, because Sophie's presence carried the kind of ambiguity that makes people uncomfortable even when nothing is said directly. The officiant began speaking softly near the front, his voice trained to carry grief without emotion. But even he seemed careful, as if every sentence had to avoid stepping on something fragile and unseen. Ethan remained standing near the aisle, not moving toward the front yet, his attention briefly returning to the casket where Lillian Hart lay unseen, her name resting on a polished plaque that reflected the ceiling lights like a mirror no one wanted to look in it too long. Lillian Hart had been described in quiet conversations as graceful, intelligent, and deeply private, the kind of person who did not need attention to be remembered. And yet today her absence was not what filled the room. It was the weight of everything surrounding her absence. Sophie adjusted her posture slightly, smoothing a small crease in her dress, her expression unchanged, but her eyes flickered toward the casket before returning to Ethan, as though measuring something only she could interpret. Near the back of the hall, an older man whispered again, this time more certain, "That's her." And though he did not specify who her was, the meaning rippled outward anyway, reaching people who had already begun to suspect that grief was not the only thing being buried here. Ethan finally took a step forward toward the front, but paused again when a soft rustle came from the entrance doors, a sound so small it almost disappeared beneath the hush of the room. Yet in a place like this, even the smallest disturbance carried weight. The doors opened wider, and for a brief moment a draft of colder air swept through the cathedral, causing a few heads to turn instinctively, expecting another guest, another mourner, another face from the past. But instead what appeared was something far smaller, a child standing uncertainly at the threshold, holding a folded piece of paper in both hands as if it were the only thing keeping him steady. The boy did not speak, did not rush, simply looked forward with quiet focus, his presence immediately altering the atmosphere in a way no one could ignore, because children do not belong in places where adults pretend to have control over grief. Sophie's smile faded almost imperceptibly as her gaze shifted toward the child, her composure tightening just slightly, while Ethan's expression remained unchanged, though something in his eyes sharpened as if Recognition was trying to surface, but had not yet formed into certainty. The child took a step forward, then another, moving slowly down the center aisle between rows of silent observers, the paper in his hand trembling just enough to show it mattered, and every step he took seemed to pull attention away from everything else in the room, including the casket, including the whispers, including the carefully maintained calm of the adults who suddenly no longer felt in control of the space they were in. Sophie's fingers curled subtly at her side, her earlier confidence now restrained by something less visible but far more tense. While Ethan finally turned his full attention toward the child, standing still as if waiting for something unspoken to reveal itself. The room, once filled with controlled mourning, now carried a different kind of silence, one that was no longer respectful but anticipatory, as if everyone instinctively understood that the moment they were in was no longer about farewell but about interruption. The child reached the front row and stopped, looking up briefly at Ethan, then toward the casket, then back down at the folded paper in his hands. And in that pause the entire cathedral seemed to contract, as if all the air had gathered itself into a single point. Sophie took a slow breath, her expression carefully rebuilt but no longer entirely steady, while Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the child, unblinking, unreadable, waiting. And as the boy finally lifted the paper slightly, preparing to speak or present what he had brought, the room held itself in a fragile stillness that felt one heartbeat away from breaking into something no one there was prepared to name. The child remained standing at the front of the cathedral aisle, as if the weight of every adult gaze pressing against him had turned into something physically tangible in the air. Yet he did not step back, only tightened his small grip on the folded paper in his hands while looking up toward the man who stood closest to the casket. And in that moment Ethan Caldwell did not move forward nor retreat. He simply observed with a stillness that made him appear even more distant from the emotion surrounding him, as though grief and memory were locked behind a door he had not yet chosen to open. Sophie Lane, standing a few steps behind him, adjusted her posture slightly, her earlier faint composure now replaced with a careful neutrality that did not quite hide the tension in her jaw. And though she kept her eyes forward, they occasionally flickered toward the child as if trying to calculate the meaning of his presence before anyone else could define it for her. The officiant paused mid-sentence, sensing that the rhythm of the ceremony had already been interrupted by something no longer ceremonial, and the silence that followed was not respectful but expectant, like the entire room had collectively leaned forward without physically moving. The child finally lifted the folded paper a little higher, hesitating just long enough for the weight of anticipation to settle fully over the crowd, and when he spoke, his voice was soft but clear enough to carry through the cathedral. Without effort, asking only for confirmation of identity, as if he had been rehearsing the words for a long time in a place where no one could hear him. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, trying to surface through layers of restraint. And for the first time, he took a step closer to the child, closing the distance by only a few feet. But in a room like this, even a small movement felt amplified, like a signal to everyone watching that something irreversible was about to unfold. Sophie's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, her lips pressing together for a brief moment before relaxing again into something controlled. Yet the subtle tightening in her shoulders betrayed a shift in confidence that had not been there before. The child looked down at the paper, then back up again, and unfolded it carefully with both hands, revealing documents that were not yet visible to the wider room, but clearly held importance based on the way several people in the front row leaned forward instinctively. Ethan extended his hand slightly, not yet taking anything, but indicating a willingness to receive what was being shown, though his face remained composed in a way that suggested he was bracing for a truth he had either long suspected or successfully avoided. The paper passed into his hand with a slight tremor from the child, and as Ethan looked down at it, the shift in his expression was subtle but unmistakable, not shock, not confusion, but a tightening of focus that caused the room's attention to sharpen instantly around him. Sophie took a small step forward now, her voice soft but deliberate as she asked a question that carried more restraint than urgency, as if she were trying to control the narrative before it could slip away from her entirely. But Ethan did not respond immediately, his eyes scanning the contents of the document with increasing stillness. The kind of stillness that comes when information aligns too precisely with something already stored in memory. The child remained where he was, watching Ethan closely, not speaking again, as if his role was not to explain but simply to deliver. And in that quiet posture there was something unsettlingly mature, something that made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats without understanding why. The officiant lowered his gaze slightly, recognizing that continuing the ceremony was no longer possible in the traditional sense, and yet no one dared to interrupt the moment unfolding at the front because it no longer belonged to ritual, it belonged to revelation. Ethan finally lowered the document slightly, his eyes lifting from the paper to the child, and in that exchange, something unspoken passed between them, not confirmation, not denial, but a recognition of connection that had existed outside this moment long before anyone in the room was aware of it. Sophie's breathing appeared, measured, controlled, but the slight tightening at the corners of her mouth suggested that she understood more than she was willing to acknowledge aloud. And for the first time her earlier composure began to show faint signs of strain. Whispers began again in the background, not loud enough to form words clearly, but enough to indicate that the audience was beginning to assemble meaning from fragments, constructing narratives out of partial information the way people always do when certainty is not immediately available. Ethan took another step forward, now standing directly in front of the child, and for a brief moment the entire cathedral felt suspended, as if even the air itself had paused to observe what would happen next. The child looked up at him steadily, then down at the document again, then back up, as if confirming that the right person was indeed standing in front of him. And when Ethan spoke, his voice was low, controlled, and careful, asking only for clarity rather than reaction. Sophie's gaze flickered between them, her hands now no longer fully still, resting together but slightly tense. And though she attempted to maintain her composed exterior, the shift in energy around her had become undeniable. Ethan unfolded the document fully now, revealing official-looking pages that seemed to contain structured information rather than emotion, and as he scanned them line by line, his expression shifted once more, not dramatically, but enough for those closest to him to notice a subtle recalibration of certainty. The child stepped back half a step, not out of fear but respect for the space being created, while Ethan continued reading, the silence in the room now so absolute that even the smallest movement felt amplified. Sophie finally spoke again, her tone carefully measured, asking for the document to be clarified, but Ethan still did not respond immediately, instead continuing to process what he was seeing with a level of focus that made it clear that contents carried weight beyond the immediate moment. When he finally looked up again, it was not at Sophie, but at the child, and the expression in his eyes had shifted into something more complex than anyone had seen from him since the beginning of the ceremony. Something that suggested the foundation of what the room believed about this day was no longer stable. The child did not smile, did not react, simply waited, as if the next words spoken were no longer his responsibility, but someone else's. And in that stillness the entire cathedral seemed to understand, without being told, that whatever had been hidden until now was no longer capable of remaining hidden any longer. The silence inside the cathedral had changed its shape, no longer the respectful stillness of mourning, but something denser, something closer to anticipation, as Ethan Caldwell stood motionless near the front, holding the document that the child had placed in his hands, his eyes scanning line after line with a focus so sharp it seemed to remove him from the room entirely. While behind him Sophie Lane remained perfectly still in appearance, but no longer entirely steady in presence, her fingers lightly clasped yet subtly tense, her gaze fixed on Ethan as if trying to read the direction of his thoughts before they became visible to anyone else. The child stood a few steps away now, no longer approaching, simply observing, his small hands empty, but his posture unchanged, as though the act of delivering what he carried had already fulfilled its purpose, and everything that followed belonged to adults who had long stopped asking the right questions. Ethan's expression shifted gradually, not in shock, but in recognition that deepened slowly, like something previously denied was now returning with undeniable structure. And the more he read, the more the room seemed to lose its ability to remain neutral. because even without words being spoken aloud, something significant was clearly unfolding in the space between what was written and what had been lived. Sophie finally broke the silence again, her voice carefully controlled, asking for clarification with a calmness that did not fully match the tightness in her posture. But Ethan did not respond immediately, his attention still anchored to the document, as if the act of looking away would disrupt the fragile understanding forming in his mind. The officiant had now stepped fully back from the center, recognizing that his role had been replaced by something far more unstable than ceremony, and the guests in the pews no longer whispered freely, but instead exchanged fragmented glances, each trying to interpret the same unfolding moment from slightly different angles. Ethan turned a page within the document slowly, and the motion itself drew more attention than any spoken statement could have, because it carried the weight of decision rather than curiosity. And when his eyes stopped again, there was a noticeable stillness in his face that suggested confirmation rather than discovery. Sophie took a small step forward, her voice tightening slightly as she repeated her request for explanation. But this time there was a subtle fracture in her composure, something that made her words feel less like control and more like resistance against an outcome she could already sense approaching. The child shifted his weight slightly, glancing once toward the casket and then back to Ethan, as if measuring whether what was about to happen still required his presence. And in that small gesture there was an unexpected sense of emotional distance, not coldness, but familiarity with uncertainty. Ethan finally lowered the document completely, holding it now at his side, and looked directly at Sophie for the first time since the exchange began. And that shift alone changed the temperature of the room, because attention that had been divided was now focused into a single direction. Sophie met his gaze without hesitation, but something in her expression tightened, as if she understood that the balance she had maintained until now was no longer intact, and the faint confidence that had accompanied her earlier presence began to erode into something more defensive. Ethan spoke at last, his voice measured and calm, not raised but firm enough to draw complete attention, asking a question that reframed everything in the room not as speculation but as verification. And in response, Sophie's expression flickered briefly before she answered, her tone carefully structured but no longer entirely smooth. The guests reacted subtly, some leaning forward slightly while others froze in place, because the exchange between the two of them carried implications that were beginning to extend beyond the walls of the cathedral. Ethan glanced once more at the child, then back to Sophie, and for a moment it seemed as though he was aligning separate pieces of a timeline that had never fully connected in public view. And the more he processed, the more the silence in the room felt like it was waiting for a verdict rather than an explanation. Sophie attempted to reassert composure, lifting her chin slightly as she spoke again. But her words now carried a defensive edge that had not been present earlier, and the shift was noticeable enough that even those unfamiliar with the underlying situation could sense a change in control. The child remained still, watching both of them without expression, as if confirming that what was unfolding was not unexpected but simply delayed. And Ethan's attention returned to the document briefly before he closed it entirely, signaling that he no longer needed to continue reading in order to understand its significance. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but more definitive, and the effect it had on the room was immediate, because it redirected attention from uncertainty toward interpretation, and interpretation toward consequence. Sophie's eyes narrowed slightly, not in aggression but in recognition that the conversation was moving beyond her ability to redirect it, and for the first time her gaze flickered away from Ethan and toward the child with a complexity that suggested competing interpretations of the same truth. Ethan took a small step forward, closing the remaining distance between himself and the front row, and the movement was enough to cause several guests to adjust their posture instinctively, as though physical proximity to resolution required readiness. The officiant looked down, no longer attempting to intervene, while the cathedral itself seemed to hold a uniform silence that was now heavy with expectation. Ethan's voice came again, steady and controlled, addressing not just Sophie, but the implications surrounding her presence. And as he spoke, Sophie's expression shifted in small increments, each one revealing a layer of awareness that had previously been concealed beneath composure. The child finally moved for the first time in several moments, stepping slightly closer to Ethan, not urgently, but with quiet intention, and that movement alone subtly altered the focus of the room once more. Ethan acknowledged the child's presence with a brief glance, then returned his attention forward, and in doing so created a triangle of attention that defined the emotional center of the entire cathedral. Sophie attempted to speak again, but this time her voice did not fully hold its earlier steadiness, and she paused mid-sentence, recalibrating before continuing in a more restrained tone. Ethan did not interrupt her, allowing her words to exist fully in the space, but his expression no longer reflected uncertainty, only alignment with information that had now reached conclusion rather than speculation. The guests remained silent, their earlier curiosity now replaced by the awareness that they were witnessing not a moment of mourning but a moment of correction, where unseen narratives were being restructured in real time. Sophie's hands tightened briefly before relaxing again, a gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for the absolute stillness of the room. And when she finally finished speaking, there was no immediate response from Ethan, only a long pause that felt heavier than any answer could have been. He looked once more at the child, and this time the expression in his eyes carried a recognition that did not require confirmation, while the cathedral itself seemed to settle into a silence that no longer waited for revelation, but for consequence. The silence that followed Ethan Caldwell's last gaze toward the child did not fade, but instead deepened, as if the entire cathedral had shifted into a state where even breathing felt like an interruption to something still forming beneath the surface of what everyone believed they understood. And Ethan stood motionless near the front pew holding the folded document at his side, while his attention remained fixed on the space between the child and Sophie Lane, as though the physical distance between them contained answers that words had not yet fully revealed. Sophie remained in place with her posture carefully maintained, yet there was an unmistakable change in her presence, something subtle but persistent in the way her shoulders no longer appeared fully relaxed, and though her face carried composure, her eyes betrayed a calculation that had become less confident with each passing moment. The child stood quietly, now closer to Ethan than before, his small hands empty but his stance steady, as if he had already completed the task he came to perform and now simply observed the consequences unfolding without needing to guide them further. Ethan finally turned his attention back to Sophie, his voice calm but no longer neutral, asking a question that reframed the entire situation not as speculation but as alignment of facts already in motion. And the way Sophie responded suggested she understood the question was not about clarification anymore, but about confirmation of something irreversible. A faint shift passed through the room as guests recognized that the conversation at the front was no longer part of the ceremony, but something entirely separate, something that had overwritten the purpose of mourning with the weight of unresolved truth. Ethan took a slow step forward, closing the gap between himself and Sophie by only a few feet. But the effect was significant because it placed him fully within the same emotional space as her, rather than observing from distance. And for the first time, Sophie's composure showed strain in the way her lips pressed together briefly before she answered, her voice still controlled but no longer as smooth as before. The officiant remained silent, having fully withdrawn from any attempt to guide the proceedings, and the guests now sat in stillness that was no longer respectful but anticipatory, as though waiting for an explanation that would determine how everything they had witnessed should be understood. Ethan's eyes shifted briefly toward the child again, and in that glance something subtle changed in his expression, not shock, but recognition deepening into certainty, as if a memory he had not consciously accessed had begun aligning itself with present reality. Sophie noticed the shift and responded quickly, speaking again with careful emphasis, attempting to redirect meaning back into structure she could control, but Ethan did not interrupt, allowing her words to exist fully before responding with a quiet finality that indicated he was no longer uncertain about the direction of interpretation. The child moved slightly closer once more, standing now almost directly between Ethan and Sophie, but not interfering, simply present, as though his role was to ensure that what was being acknowledged could not be separated from its consequences. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly to the document again, but did not reopen it, signaling that the contents had already been absorbed fully, and when he spoke next, His tone carried a clarity that shifted the room from interpretation into understanding. Even though no explicit declaration had yet been made, Sophie's expression tightened. Again, and for the first time she looked away from Ethan toward the casket at the front of the cathedral, where Lillian Hart remained the unseen center of everything unfolding, and that glance alone suggested that the connection between past and present was no longer theoretical but direct. Ethan followed her gaze briefly toward the casket and then returned his attention forward. And in that movement, the emotional axis of the room subtly reoriented itself, as though the presence of the deceased had become part of the dialogue without needing to be spoken aloud. A soft rustle moved through the audience as people adjusted their positions, some leaning forward slightly, while others sat rigidly still, each reacting to a shared sense that the narrative they had assumed at the beginning of the ceremony was no longer intact. Sophie attempted once more to speak with controlled precision, but her tone now carried an undertone of urgency that had not been present earlier, and Ethan responded. Not immediately, but with a measured pause that extended the tension rather than resolving it, allowing the weight of what was already understood to settle fully into the space between them. The child remained silent but attentive, his gaze moving between Ethan and Sophie in a steady rhythm, as if tracking alignment rather than emotion, and the simplicity of his presence contrasted sharply with the complexity building around him. Ethan finally spoke again, and this time his words carried a structure that suggested conclusion rather than inquiry, prompting a visible reaction from Sophie, whose composure shifted just enough to indicate that she recognized the direction of the conversation had reached a point she could no longer redirect. She answered, but her response lacked the earlier stability, and the careful control she had maintained now appeared fragmented into smaller, less certain components. While Ethan listened without interruption, his expression steady but no longer detached, the cathedral felt increasingly removed from its original purpose, with the ritual space fully overtaken by a different kind of unfolding, one defined not by mourning but by the reassembly of hidden connections. Ethan took another step forward, now standing almost directly beside the child, and in doing so established a visual alignment that made the relationship between them unavoidable to anyone watching, regardless of prior understanding. Sophie noticed this alignment and paused briefly before speaking again, but her voice now carried less authority and more explanation, as if she was no longer trying to control interpretation but simply complete it before others did. Ethan listened, then shifted his attention briefly toward the congregation, acknowledging the presence of witnesses who had become part of the moment whether intentionally or not. And when he turned back, his expression suggested that what had once been fragmented across time and assumption had now formed a single coherent recognition. The child remained still, looking up at Ethan without expectation, and for the first time the stillness in the room no longer felt like waiting, but like acknowledgement that the boundary between unknown and known had already been crossed. Sophie's final attempt to maintain composure appeared in the way she straightened slightly and adjusted her posture, but it was clear that the structural confidence she had entered the space with was no longer intact, and Ethan's next silence confirmed that the moment had shifted beyond discussion into consequence. The guests remained frozen in collective attention, the officiant fully withdrawn, and the cathedral itself seemed to hold its breath not in anticipation of revelation, but in recognition that revelation had already occurred and only its meaning remained to be understood. The atmosphere inside the cathedral had settled into a strange equilibrium where nothing moved outwardly, yet everything felt like it was shifting beneath the surface of what people believed they were witnessing. And Ethan Caldwell stood now closer to the center aisle with the child still positioned near him, while Sophie Lane remained a few steps behind with her posture carefully maintained but no longer fully stable, her presence carrying the quiet tension of someone who understood that the structure supporting her position was no longer intact. Ethan's expression had changed into something more definitive, no longer searching but aligning, as if separate fragments of time were finally locking into place inside his understanding. And though he did not speak immediately, the silence he held carried more weight than any explanation could have. The child looked up at him briefly, then down again toward the document that had already been seen and absorbed, and in that small movement, there was a sense of completion, as if his role had always been to initiate recognition rather than to control its outcome. Sophie finally stepped forward again, her voice carefully measured but now noticeably restrained, attempting to reclaim structure by framing what had been revealed in terms she could still manage. Yet Ethan did not respond directly to her framing, instead allowing a long pause that stretched across the room and made every guest feel the absence of certainty more sharply than before. The officiant remained motionless near the front, no longer attempting to participate, his role reduced to silent witness as the ceremony transformed into something entirely different from its original purpose, while the guests themselves sat frozen in collective attention. Their earlier whispers now completely dissolved into silence. Ethan slowly turned his head towards Sophie, and when he spoke, his tone was calm, but carried a finality that subtly altered the emotional direction of the entire space, because it no longer invited interpretation but instead demanded acknowledgement of what had already been implied. Sophie's response came quickly, but it lacked the smooth control she had maintained earlier, and there was a slight hesitation between her words that revealed the effort required to maintain composure in a situation that was no longer predictable. Ethan listened without interruption, his gaze steady and unyielding, and as she continued speaking, the gap between explanation and certainty widened in a way that made her argument feel less like clarification and more like resistance against an outcome already in motion. The child shifted his weight slightly but remained quiet, his attention moving between both adults as if observing a sequence that had been unfolding long before this moment and would continue long after it ended. And the simplicity of his presence contrasted sharply with the complexity building around him. Ethan finally took a step forward again, reducing the distance between himself and Sophie to a point where their conversation could no longer be separated from the awareness of the room. And that movement caused a subtle ripple of attention among the guests who instinctively understood that something decisive was approaching. Sophie adjusted her stance, her hands briefly tightening before returning to stillness. And when she spoke again, her tone was quieter, less structured, as though she was now addressing not just Ethan but the reality of being fully observed by everyone present. Ethan's eyes flickered briefly toward the casket at the front of the cathedral, where Lillian Hart remained the unseen center of all attention, and that glance created a connection between past absence and present confrontation that made the emotional weight of the moment more complex than simple revelation. The guests followed his gaze instinctively, and for a brief moment the entire room seemed to orient itself around the casket as if it had become the reference point for everything unfolding. Even though nothing physically had changed in that direction, Ethan returned his attention forward and exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in a measured release of restraint. And when he spoke again, his words carried the structure of final understanding rather than inquiry, signaling that whatever uncertainty had existed had now reached resolution within him, even if it had not yet been fully acknowledged by others. Sophie reacted subtly to this shift, her expression tightening again. But this time, there was less resistance and more recognition that the framework she had been relying on was no longer applicable in the presence of what was now understood. The child stepped slightly closer to Ethan again, and in doing so positioned himself within the center of attention without needing to assert himself, as if the natural alignment of truth had drawn him forward without effort. Ethan looked down at him briefly, and in that glance there was a recognition that no longer required external confirmation, because the connection between what had been presented and what had been understood had already solidified. Sophie's voice came again, but it now carried an uneven rhythm, and though she attempted to maintain composure, the subtle fragmentation in her delivery suggested that she was no longer speaking from certainty, but from adaptation to an unfolding reality. Ethan did not interrupt her immediately, allowing her words to settle fully into the space before responding, and the pause that followed was long enough that several guests began to shift their posture again, sensing that the moment was reaching a transition point where explanation would no longer define direction. When Ethan finally spoke, his tone was lower but unmistakably definitive, and the effect was immediate, because it restructured the emotional hierarchy of the room without requiring additional clarification. Sophie's gaze briefly dropped before returning to him, And in that small movement, there was a visible acknowledgement that control over interpretation had fully slipped away. The child remained still, looking between them one final time, and then toward the casket, as if completing a silent cycle of attention that had guided him since his arrival. Ethan turned slightly toward the congregation, acknowledging their presence not as participants, but as witnesses, and in doing so expanded the weight of the moment beyond the immediate exchange between him and Sophie. The guests remained silent, but their stillness now carried awareness rather than confusion, as though they understood that what they had witnessed was no longer developing but already established in meaning. Sophie stood without speaking for a brief moment, then lowered her gaze slightly, her posture still upright, but no longer projecting the confidence she had entered with, and Ethan's attention returned once more to the child, where it settled with calm certainty. In that final alignment of gaze and presence, the cathedral seemed to reach a state of conclusion not through words but through recognition, as if the truth had already been fully revealed, and only its acceptance remained within the silence that followed. The cathedral remained suspended in a silence so complete that it felt less like absence of sound, and more like the presence of something undeniable settling over every person seated within it. And Ethan Caldwell stood at the front now with a stillness that no longer carried uncertainty, but instead reflected a quiet internal alignment, as though every fragmented assumption he had carried into this moment had finally been reorganized into a single unavoidable truth. The child stood near him, without movement, his small presence no longer introducing disruption but instead reinforcing clarity, while Sophie Lane remained a few steps behind with her posture still upright, yet visibly restrained, her earlier composure now replaced by a controlled stillness that no longer fully masked the emotional recalibration happening beneath it. Ethan's gaze lingered forward for a long moment, not on Sophie, not on the guests, but on the space where Lillian Hart's casket rested, and in that fixed attention there was a subtle acknowledgement that what had unfolded was not simply about revelation, but about the rearrangement of meaning around a life that had ended too early for its full story to be understood in real time. A faint movement passed through the congregation as people shifted slightly, no longer whispering, but instead watching with a collective awareness that the moment had transitioned beyond interpretation into consequence. And Ethan finally lowered his hand that had been holding the document, no longer needing to reference it as confirmation because its contents had already settled into certainty within him. Sophie attempted to speak again, her voice carefully measured but noticeably softer than before, as if she was trying to preserve a structure that had already begun to collapse around her. Yet Ethan did not respond immediately, allowing her words to exist fully in the silence before acknowledging them with a calmness that no longer engaged in negotiation but instead reflected resolution. The child looked up briefly at Ethan again, then toward the casket, and then back to the adults in front of him. And in that simple sequence, there was something profoundly grounding, as though his presence had not been to disrupt, but to ensure that what was hidden would no longer remain disconnected from reality. Ethan finally spoke again, and when he did, his voice carried a steadiness that caused even the faintest background movement in the cathedral to cease, because the tone no longer invited interpretation but instead defined understanding, and Sophie's reaction to those words was immediate though subtle, her shoulders tightening slightly before relaxing again into a posture that now seemed more defensive than composed. The guests remained frozen in collective attention, their earlier uncertainty replaced by a growing awareness that the structure of relationships they had assumed was being quietly rewritten in front of them without dramatic announcement, only through the alignment of recognition and silence. Ethan took a small step forward, not toward Sophie but toward the center line between them, and in doing so he established a visual balance that placed the child at the center of both attention and implication, creating a configuration that made avoidance of meaning no longer possible for anyone observing. Sophie's eyes flickered briefly toward the child, then back to Ethan, and for the first time there was a visible hesitation in her response, as if the certainty she had carried into this space was no longer sufficient to maintain control over its outcome. Ethan's expression remained steady, but there was now something more defined within it, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition that had fully completed its transition into acceptance. And the weight of that acceptance shifted the emotional tone of the room, without a single additional word being spoken. The officiant remained silent near the front, his role now completely dissolved into observation, while the guests sat in a stillness that no longer felt ceremonial, but rather reflective, as though they were witnessing not the continuation of grief, but the restructuring of a narrative they had not previously understood. Sophie finally spoke again, her voice slightly lower, attempting to reframe her position within the moment. But the attempt carried less authority than before and more an effort to stabilize what could no longer be stabilized. And Ethan listened without interruption, allowing her words to reach their full expression before responding in a way that no longer addressed uncertainty, but instead acknowledged completion. The child shifted his stance slightly, still quiet, still observant, and his presence remained unchanged in tone, even as the emotional environment around him intensified in clarity, as though he existed outside the volatility of interpretation and remained anchored in simple factual presence. Ethan's attention moved once more toward the casket, and in that brief return there was a recognition that extended beyond the immediate exchange, connecting present understanding to absence and memory in a way that did not require verbal explanation. And Sophie noticed that shift, her gaze following his before returning forward, where she now stood in a space that felt increasingly defined by observation rather than participation. Ethan exhaled slowly, a controlled and measured breath that marked not emotional collapse, but the release of internal resistance. And when he spoke again, his words carried a finality that restructured the emotional hierarchy of the entire cathedral, because what he stated did not introduce new information, but instead confirmed what had already become understood without announcement. Sophie's reaction was minimal but significant, her expression tightening briefly before settling into a quieter stillness. And in that stillness, there was recognition that the narrative she had once been able to influence was no longer responsive to adjustment. The child remained in place, now fully integrated into the center of attention without effort, and Ethan looked down at him briefly with an expression that carried acknowledgement rather than question, and in that moment the connection between them became the silent axis around which all remaining uncertainty dissolved. The guests, still silent, no longer shifted or whispered, because the structure of ambiguity that had previously allowed interpretation had now been replaced with something more defined, even if not explicitly spoken, and the cathedral itself seemed to settle into a state of conclusion where nothing further needed to be revealed for understanding to be complete. Sophie lowered her gaze slightly for the first time, not in defeat, but in recognition that the moment had moved beyond her capacity to influence. And Ethan turned once more toward the front where the casket rested, holding that gaze with a calm that suggested acceptance, rather than unresolved tension. And in that final alignment of presence, attention, and silence, the room reached a collective understanding that what had been hidden had already been fully exposed, and what remained was not discovery, but the irreversible acknowledgement of truth already present in full view. The cathedral had reached a silence so complete that it no longer felt like part of the building itself, but rather like a shared state of awareness between every person inside it. And Ethan Caldwell stood near the front aisle with an expression that no longer shifted between interpretation and uncertainty, because everything he had been shown, everything he had been given, and everything he had understood had now settled into a single uninterrupted conclusion within him. The child remained near his side, no longer moving, no longer presenting anything, simply existing in stillness as if his purpose had already been fulfilled the moment recognition began to form in others, while Sophie Lane stood a few steps behind with her posture still upright, but her emotional structure visibly restrained, as though she had entered a space where control was no longer something she could actively maintain but only attempt to preserve in fragments. Ethan's gaze rested forward for several seconds, not toward the guests, not toward Sophie, but toward the casket at the front where Lillian Hart remained the silent center of everything unfolding. And in that prolonged stillness, there was a sense that the meaning of the entire gathering had shifted away from farewell and toward understanding something that had been concealed beneath surface perception for far longer than anyone had realized. A subtle movement passed through the room as people adjusted their posture, but there was no longer any whispering, because even curiosity had been replaced by the awareness that interpretation was no longer necessary when clarity had already arrived without announcement. Ethan finally lowered his hand completely, no longer holding the document in a way that suggested reference or confirmation, and when he spoke, his voice carried a calmness that did not invite response, but instead acknowledged completion, as though what needed to be said was no longer about discovery, but about acceptance. Sophie reacted to his words with a slight tightening of her expression, her eyes briefly flickering toward the child before returning to Ethan, and in that moment, there was a visible realization that the structure she had relied upon to maintain her position in this situation had fully dissolved, not through confrontation but through alignment of understanding that no longer required her interpretation. The child shifted his gaze once more toward Ethan, then toward the casket, and finally toward Sophie. And in that sequence there was a quiet sense of closure forming, not emotional but structural. As if all remaining uncertainty had been redistributed into clarity that no longer depended on further explanation. Ethan took a step forward into the center aisle, not aggressively, not decisively in a dramatic sense, but with a calmness that repositioned him within the emotional center of the space, and that movement alone caused the entire room to remain completely still, because it signaled not escalation but final alignment. Sophie's posture changed subtly in response, her hands no longer fully relaxed, her gaze now fixed forward with an intensity that suggested awareness of consequence rather than anticipation of outcome. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a controlled restraint that no longer functioned as dominance, but as an attempt to stabilize meaning in a situation that had already moved beyond her control. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression steady and unchanged, and as she continued speaking, the difference between explanation and acceptance became increasingly clear, because what she offered now no longer shifted perception but instead attempted to preserve position within a framework that was no longer responsive. The guests remained silent, their collective attention no longer divided but unified toward the front where every movement carried significance, and even the officiant stood completely still, no longer attempting to intervene or redirect, fully aware that the structure of ceremony had been replaced by something more permanent in consequence. Ethan finally responded, not immediately, but after a deliberate pause that allowed the weight of everything already understood to fully settle into the room. And when he spoke, his tone reflected resolution rather than inquiry, signaling that what remained was no longer interpretation but acknowledgement of a reality already established. Sophie's reaction was subtle but undeniable, her expression tightening briefly before softening into stillness. And in that stillness, there was recognition that further resistance would not alter the direction of what had already been fully formed. The child remained in place, no longer central through movement, but through presence, and Ethan glanced down at him once more with an expression that carried acknowledgement rather than question, and in that brief exchange there was a quiet completion of alignment that required no external validation. Sophie's gaze dropped slightly for the first time, not in collapse, but in acceptance of position within a structure that had already redefined itself without her participation, and when she lifted her eyes again, they no longer carried the same certainty that had been present earlier. Ethan turned his attention once more toward the casket, and in doing so re-established the emotional axis of the room around absence rather than confrontation, and that shift caused the entire cathedral to feel less like a place of ongoing tension and more like a space where resolution had already occurred and was simply being witnessed. The guests remained completely still, their earlier uncertainty now replaced with understanding that did not require confirmation, and the silence that filled the cathedral was no longer waiting for revelation but resting in the aftermath of it. Sophie stood quietly, her posture still composed but no longer projecting control, and Ethan remained steady at the front with the child near him, both positioned within a final alignment that suggested no further disruption would follow, because everything necessary to be understood had already been revealed within the stillness that now defined the room. The cathedral had settled into a silence so absolute that even the smallest movement felt like it carried meaning, and Ethan Caldwell stood at the front aisle with his attention no longer divided between uncertainty and interpretation, because everything he had been shown had already resolved into a single internal alignment that no longer required validation from anyone else in the room. The child remained close to him, not touching, not speaking, but positioned in a way that made his presence unavoidable in the emotional structure of the moment, while Sophie Lane stood several steps behind with her posture still carefully composed, yet now lacking the subtle confidence that had defined her earlier presence, as if the space she had once controlled no longer responded to her intent. Ethan's gaze remained fixed forward for an extended moment, not on Sophie, not on the guests, but on the casket resting at the front where Lillian Hart's presence, though physically absent, continued to define the emotional gravity of everything unfolding. And in that sustained silence, there was an unspoken recognition that what had begun as mourning had transformed into something far more permanent in consequence. A faint shift passed through the congregation as people adjusted their attention, but no one spoke, because the collective understanding of the room had already moved beyond curiosity into acceptance, and the absence of dialogue now felt intentional rather than uncertain. Ethan finally lowered his hand completely, no longer referencing the document that had been central moments earlier, and when he spoke, his voice carried a calmness that did not invite response, but instead confirmed final understanding, as though the structure of uncertainty had already collapsed and only acknowledgement remained. Sophie reacted with a subtle tightening of her expression, her eyes briefly moving toward the child before returning to Ethan. And in that brief exchange, there was a visible recognition that the framework she had been relying on to maintain her position had fully dissolved under the weight of what had already been understood without needing further explanation. The child shifted his stance slightly, his attention moving between Ethan and Sophie in a steady rhythm that suggested he was no longer delivering information, but simply witnessing the result of it. And that quiet presence anchored the emotional center of the room in a way that no spoken statement could have achieved. Ethan took a slow step forward into the center aisle, not as a gesture of confrontation, but as a repositioning of clarity. And that single movement redefined the visual balance of the space, drawing every gaze toward him without effort or demand. Sophie's posture adjusted subtly in response, her hands now held with more restraint than ease. And when she spoke again, her tone carried careful structure, but no longer the authority it had once attempted to maintain, because the environment around her no longer supported interpretation in her favor. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression steady and unchanged, and as she continued speaking, the distinction between explanation and resistance became increasingly apparent. Because what she offered no longer shaped perception, but instead attempted to preserve structure that had already been internally resolved by everyone present. The guests remained completely still, their attention unified toward the front where the emotional center of the event had fully shifted, and even the officiant stood motionless, no longer attempting to guide proceedings, fully aware that ceremony had been replaced by consequence. Ethan finally responded after a measured pause, and when he did, his tone reflected conclusion rather than inquiry, signaling that what remained was no longer discovery, but acknowledgement of what had already been fully understood within the silence that surrounded them. Sophie's reaction was restrained but visible, her expression tightening briefly before settling again into stillness. And in that stillness, there was recognition that further resistance would not alter the direction of what had already been established. The child remained positioned near Ethan, no longer central through movement, but through alignment. And Ethan glanced down at him once more with a calm acknowledgement that required no verbal confirmation, because the connection between presence and understanding had already been fully completed within the moment. Sophie's gaze lowered slightly for the first time, not in defeat, but in recognition that the structure she had entered with no longer functioned within the reality that now defined the room. And when she lifted her eyes again, the certainty that had once been present had been replaced with quiet restraint. Ethan turned his attention once more toward the casket, and in doing so re-established the emotional axis of the cathedral, around absence rather than confrontation, causing the entire room to feel less like a space of unfolding revelation and more like a space where resolution had already occurred and was simply being acknowledged by those present. The guests remained silent, their earlier uncertainty now fully replaced by understanding that did not require explanation, and the silence that filled the cathedral was no longer waiting for further development, but resting in the finality of what had already been revealed. Sophie stood still, her posture composed but no longer projecting control, while Ethan remained steady at the front with the child near him, both positioned within a final alignment that suggested no further disruption would follow, because everything necessary to be understood had already been fully established within the stillness that now defined the entire room. The silence inside the cathedral had deepened into something almost structural, as if the air itself had solidified around the moment Ethan Caldwell stood near the front aisle with the child positioned close beside him and Sophie Lane remaining several steps behind, her posture still carefully composed but now stripped of the subtle confidence that had once defined her presence in the room. Ethan no longer held the document in any visible sense of reliance, because what had been contained within it had already completed its transformation into understanding within him, and his gaze remained forward, anchored toward the casket where Lillian Hart rested unseen, yet still central to every emotional alignment unfolding in the space. The guests remained motionless, their earlier uncertainty now replaced with a collective awareness that the structure of what they believed they were witnessing had already shifted beyond interpretation into resolution, and even the smallest movement in the room felt unnecessary, as if silence itself had become the only appropriate response to what had already been revealed. Sophie finally shifted her stance slightly, not stepping forward but adjusting her position as though recalibrating her presence within a space that no longer responded to her intent. And when she spoke again, her voice carried restraint rather than authority, carefully constructed but noticeably diminished in its ability to define direction. Ethan did not respond immediately, allowing her words to settle into the silence fully before acknowledging them. And in that delay, the emotional weight of the room seemed to gather around the absence of interruption, making every second feel more definitive than the last. The child remained still beside Ethan, his attention moving between both adults with quiet consistency, not reacting, not seeking validation, but simply existing as a fixed point within a structure that had already aligned itself around his presence. And that simplicity made the complexity of everything else feel even more pronounced. Ethan finally turned his head slightly toward Sophie, and when he spoke, his voice carried a calm finality that no longer engaged with uncertainty, but instead confirmed internal resolution, and the effect of that tone rippled through the room not as surprise, but as recognition, because it aligned with what everyone had already begun to understand without needing it explicitly stated. Sophie's expression tightened briefly, a subtle reaction that suggested awareness of position rather than emotional collapse, and her gaze flickered once toward the child before returning to Ethan, as if attempting to locate a remaining point of stability within a situation that no longer offered any. Ethan took a small step forward, not toward confrontation but toward completion of spatial alignment, and that movement subtly redefined the center of attention in the cathedral, drawing all visual focus toward the axis formed between him, Sophie, and the child. The officiant remained completely still, no longer attempting to guide or interpret the proceedings, fully aware that the function of ceremony had dissolved into something irreversible. While the guests remained silent, their attention unified in a way that no longer reflected curiosity but acceptance of an outcome already understood. Sophie attempted once more to speak, her tone measured but now carrying an undercurrent of strain, and though her words remained structured, they no longer carried the ability to shift perception, because the foundation of interpretation had already been removed from her control. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, and as she continued, the difference between explanation and resistance became increasingly visible, not through volume, but through diminishing influence over the room's emotional direction. The child shifted his weight slightly, still not speaking, but his presence remained central not through action but through alignment, and in that alignment, there was a sense of inevitability that extended beyond the immediate conversation. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly toward the casket once more, and that brief moment of attention toward absence reinforced the emotional core of the room, reminding everyone present that everything unfolding was ultimately connected to what was no longer physically there yet remained structurally central to understanding. Sophie followed his gaze for a moment before returning forward, And in that shared orientation toward absence, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that the past and present had become inseparable within this moment. Ethan exhaled slowly, not in emotional release, but in completion of internal processing. And when he spoke again, his words carried the kind of clarity that does not invite continuation, but instead signals conclusion, shifting the entire room from anticipation into recognition of finality. Sophie's reaction was subtle but unmistakable, her expression tightening before settling into stillness that no longer attempted to assert control. And in that stillness, there was acknowledgement that the structure she had been operating within no longer existed in the way she had understood it. The child remained steady, his gaze briefly moving from Ethan to Sophie, and then toward the casket again, completing a silent circuit of attention that seemed to mirror the emotional architecture of the room itself. Ethan then turned his attention fully toward Sophie, and the silence that followed his gaze carried more weight than any additional statement, because it marked the point at which dialogue had fully transitioned into recognition. Sophie did not respond immediately, and in that pause the guests remained completely still, their collective awareness now unified around the understanding that no further clarification was necessary for meaning to be established. Ethan finally spoke once more, his tone unchanged but carrying undeniable finality, and the effect was immediate, not in reaction but in alignment, as if the room itself had already reached the same conclusion and was only now acknowledging it collectively. Sophie lowered her gaze slightly for the first time, not as defeat but as acceptance of position within a structure that no longer allowed repositioning. And when she lifted it again, the confidence that had once defined her presence had been replaced by quiet restraint. Ethan shifted his attention back toward the casket, and in doing so recentered the emotional axis of the cathedral around absence rather than confrontation, reinforcing that what had occurred was not simply revelation, but restructuring of meaning around what could no longer be changed. The guests remained silent, their earlier uncertainty now completely replaced by understanding that required no additional explanation, and the cathedral itself seemed to settle into a final state of stillness where nothing remained to be interpreted because everything had already been understood within the silence that now defined the moment. The cathedral remained in a state of stillness that no longer felt temporary, but instead felt established, as if the structure of the moment had locked itself into place and would not return to what it had been before. And Ethan Caldwell stood at the front aisle with his attention no longer divided between uncertainty and interpretation, because everything he had seen, heard, and internally confirmed had already settled into a single continuous understanding that no longer required external validation. The child remained beside him in the same position, no longer shifting or presenting anything, simply existing as a quiet constant within the emotional architecture of the room, while Sophie Lane stood several steps behind with her posture still upright, but now carrying a visible reduction in certainty that no longer allowed her presence to feel fully self-directed. Ethan's gaze remained forward toward the casket where Lillian Hart rested unseen, yet still central to the emotional gravity of everything that had unfolded. And in that sustained focus, there was an awareness that the meaning of this gathering had already moved beyond grief and into something more permanent, something that had redefined relationships, memory, and truth in a way that could not be reversed by silence or denial. The guests remained completely still, their attention no longer fragmented but unified in quiet recognition that the structure they had assumed at the beginning of the ceremony had been fully transformed without a single moment of confusion remaining, because clarity had already replaced uncertainty long before any official confirmation could be spoken. Sophie finally shifted her stance again, her movement small but noticeable, and when she spoke her voice carried controlled restraint that now felt more like careful maintenance than authority, as if she was attempting to preserve meaning within a framework that was no longer responsive to her interpretation. Ethan did not respond immediately, allowing her words to settle fully into the silence before acknowledging them. And in that delay, the emotional weight of the entire cathedral seemed to deepen rather than dissipate, because absence of interruption had become part of the resolution itself. The child looked up briefly at Ethan, then toward the casket, and then back toward Sophie, completing a slow and deliberate cycle of attention that reflected not confusion, but understanding without need for explanation, and in that simplicity there was a grounding force that contrasted sharply with the complexity surrounding the adults. Ethan finally turned his head slightly towards Sophie, and when he spoke, his voice carried calm finality that no longer engaged in interpretation, but instead confirmed internal resolution, and the effect of that tone moved through the room not as surprise, but as alignment, because everyone present had already begun to understand what it meant even before it was spoken. Sophie's expression tightened briefly, not dramatically, but enough to signal recognition that the structure she had relied upon had fully dissolved, and her gaze flickered once more toward the child before returning to Ethan as though searching for remaining stability within a situation that no longer offered any. Ethan took a slow step forward into the center aisle, not toward confrontation, but toward completion of spatial alignment, and that movement redefined the visual center of the room, drawing all attention toward the relationship between him, Sophie, and the child in a configuration that no longer allowed ambiguity to persist. The officiant remained completely still near the front, fully aware that the role of ceremony had been replaced by consequence, while the guests continued to sit in silence that now reflected understanding rather than anticipation, because nothing more needed to unfold for meaning to be complete. Sophie attempted to speak again, her tone measured but now noticeably softer and less structured, and although her words remained composed, they no longer carried the ability to shift perception, because interpretation had already moved beyond her influence and into collective recognition. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression steady and unchanged, and as she continued speaking, the difference between explanation and resistance became increasingly visible, not through emotion, but through diminishing structural control over the room's attention. The child remained steady, his presence unchanged, and his gaze moved between Ethan and Sophie in a calm rhythm that suggested he was not participating in the emotional conflict, but instead existing as the reference point around which understanding had already formed. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly toward the casket once more, and in that brief moment the emotional axis of the cathedral centered itself around absence, reinforcing that what was unfolding was not creation of new truth, but acknowledgement of what had already existed beneath silence. Sophie followed his gaze for a moment before returning forward, and in that shared orientation there was an unspoken recognition that past and present had fully merged within this moment, making separation between memory and reality no longer relevant. Ethan exhaled slowly, not as emotional release, but as completion of internal alignment, and when he spoke again his tone carried finality that did not invite continuation but instead marked the end of interpretive uncertainty, shifting the room into collective acknowledgement rather than ongoing inquiry. Sophie's reaction remained restrained but visible, her expression tightening briefly before settling into stillness that no longer attempted to assert control. And in that stillness, there was acceptance that further resistance would not alter what had already been established within the structure of understanding around them. The child remained near Ethan, no longer central through movement, but through alignment, and Ethan looked down at him once more with calm acknowledgement that required no verbal confirmation, because recognition had already been fully established through presence alone. Sophie lowered her gaze slightly for the first time in a sustained way, not in collapse, but in recognition of position within a structure that no longer functioned according to her intent, and when she lifted it again, there was no longer certainty guiding her expression. Ethan turned his attention fully toward the casket, and in doing so re-established the emotional center of the cathedral around absence rather than confrontation, reinforcing that resolution had already occurred and what remained was only its acknowledgement. The guests remained silent, their earlier uncertainty fully replaced with understanding that no longer required explanation, and the silence that filled the cathedral was no longer waiting for development, but resting in the final state of recognition. Sophie stood quietly with composed stillness that no longer projected authority. Ethan remained steady at the front with the child beside him, and in that final alignment the room reached a state where nothing further needed to be said, because everything necessary had already been understood within the silence that now defined the moment. The cathedral remained locked in a silence that no longer felt like anticipation, but instead felt like final recognition, as if every person present had already crossed the invisible threshold between uncertainty and understanding and was now only waiting for the moment that would confirm what they already knew without needing it spoken. And Ethan Caldwell stood at the front aisle with the child still positioned near him, while Sophie Lane remained several steps behind, her posture still composed, but no longer carrying the same structural certainty that had defined her earlier presence. Because the emotional architecture of the room had already shifted into a state where control no longer belonged to any one individual, but instead belonged to the unfolding alignment of truth itself. Ethan's gaze remained steady and forward, anchored toward the casket where Lillian Hart rested unseen, yet still forming the emotional center of everything that had taken place. And in that sustained stillness, there was a quiet realization that what had begun as a funeral had transformed into a moment of irreversible understanding, where grief had become secondary to recognition of what had been hidden beneath surface perception. The guests remained completely silent, their attention unified not by curiosity, but by certainty forming without need for further evidence. Because the structure of ambiguity that had once defined the room had already dissolved into clarity that no longer required interpretation. Sophie finally moved again, a subtle shift in stance that reflected less control and more recalibration. And when she spoke, her voice carried restraint that was carefully maintained but noticeably thinner than before, as though every word required effort to sustain within a space that no longer supported her framing of events. Ethan did not respond immediately, allowing her words to exist fully in the silence before acknowledging them. And in that delay, the emotional weight of the room deepened rather than dispersed, because absence of interruption had become part of the final structure of understanding. The child remained still beside Ethan, his presence unchanged and steady. And though he did not speak or gesture, the consistency of his position reinforced the emotional center of the moment, not through action but through alignment with what had already been recognized. Ethan slowly turned his head toward Sophie, and when he spoke, his voice carried calm finality that no longer engaged in inquiry but instead confirmed what had already been internally resolved. And that tone moved through the room not as revelation, but as confirmation of something already understood collectively. Sophie's expression tightened briefly, not in visible collapse, but in controlled awareness that the structure she had been relying upon had fully dissolved, and her gaze flickered once toward the child before returning to Ethan, as if searching for remaining stability in a system that no longer provided any. Ethan took a measured step forward into the center aisle, not as confrontation but as alignment, and that movement redefined the visual and emotional center of the cathedral, drawing all attention into a single axis that included him, Sophie, and the child in a configuration that no longer allowed ambiguity to persist. The officiant remained motionless near the front, fully withdrawn from any attempt to guide or interpret proceedings, because ceremony itself had already been replaced by consequence, while the guests remained seated in absolute silence, their attention unified and fixed, no longer reacting but recognizing. Sophie attempted to speak again, her tone measured but now carrying subtle strain, and although her words remained structured, they no longer carried influence over perception, because interpretation had already moved beyond her control and into collective understanding that no longer required validation. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression steady and unchanged, and as she continued, the difference between explanation and resistance became increasingly visible, not through volume or emotion, but through diminishing structural authority over the room's awareness. The child shifted his stance slightly, not in reaction, but in natural stillness, and his gaze moved between Ethan and Sophie in a quiet rhythm that suggested he was not part of the emotional conflict, but instead the fixed point around which the entire situation had already resolved itself. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly toward the casket once more, and in that moment the emotional axis of the cathedral recentered itself around absence, reinforcing that what was unfolding was not discovery, but acknowledgement of something that had already existed beneath silence long before this moment. Sophie followed his gaze briefly before returning forward, and in that shared orientation there was an unspoken recognition that past and present had fully converged within the same moment, making separation between memory and reality no longer relevant, to what was being understood. Ethan exhaled slowly, not as emotional release, but as completion of internal alignment. And when he spoke again, his tone carried finality that no longer invited continuation, but instead marked closure of uncertainty, shifting the entire room into collective recognition rather than ongoing interpretation. Sophie's reaction remained restrained but unmistakable, her expression tightening briefly before settling into stillness that no longer attempted to assert control. And in that stillness, there was acceptance that further resistance would not alter what had already been established within the structure of understanding around them. The child remained near Ethan, no longer central through movement, but through alignment, and Ethan looked down at him once more with calm acknowledgement that required no verbal confirmation, because recognition had already been fully completed through presence alone. Sophie lowered her gaze slightly for the first time in a sustained way, not as collapse, but as acknowledgement of position within a structure that no longer functioned according to her intent. And when she lifted it again, the certainty that had once defined her presence had been replaced with quiet restraint that no longer projected control. Ethan turned his attention fully towards Sophie, and the silence that followed carried more weight than any additional statement, because it marked the point at which dialogue had fully transitioned into recognition without need for explanation. Sophie did not respond immediately, and in that pause the guests remained completely still, their collective awareness now unified around the understanding that nothing further needed to be said for meaning to be complete. Ethan finally spoke once more, his tone unchanged but carrying undeniable finality, and the effect was immediate, not through reaction but through alignment, as if the room itself had already reached the same conclusion and was only now acknowledging it collectively. Sophie stood in silence, her posture composed but no longer projecting authority, and Ethan remained steady at the front with the child beside him, both positioned within a final alignment that suggested no further disruption would follow, because everything necessary to be understood had already been fully established within the silence that now defined the entire cathedral. And in that stillness, with every gaze anchored forward and every uncertainty already resolved into recognition, the moment reached its final state where truth no longer needed to be revealed, because it had already been fully seen, fully understood, and fully accepted within the quiet permanence of what remained. The silence that filled the cathedral no longer felt like something that was waiting to be broken, but instead felt like something that had already completed its purpose, as if every breath held within the space had quietly agreed that nothing further needed to be said for understanding to remain intact. And Ethan Caldwell stood at the front aisle with a calm stillness that reflected full internal resolution, his attention no longer shifting between possibilities because everything had already aligned into a single continuous recognition that no longer required interpretation. The child remained beside him in the same steady position, no longer presenting or delivering anything, simply existing as a constant presence within the emotional structure of the room, while Sophie Lane stood several steps behind with her posture still upright, but now noticeably softened at the edges, as if the structure she had relied on to maintain control had fully dissolved into something she could no longer reconstruct. Ethan's gaze remained forward toward the casket where Lillian Hart rested unseen, yet still central to the emotional gravity of everything that had unfolded. And in that sustained focus, there was a quiet acknowledgement that the meaning of this gathering had permanently shifted beyond grief into understanding that no longer required explanation or defense. The guests remained completely still, their collective attention unified in a way that no longer reflected curiosity or uncertainty, because the structure of ambiguity had already been replaced by clarity that existed without need for confirmation. And even the smallest movements within the room felt unnecessary against the weight of what had already been realized. Sophie finally moved again, a subtle shift that reflected less intention and more instinct. And when she spoke, her voice carried careful restraint, but no longer held the same structural confidence, as though every word now required effort to maintain coherence within a space that no longer responded to her framing of events. Ethan did not respond immediately, allowing her words to settle into the silence fully. And in that pause, the emotional weight of the cathedral deepened rather than dispersed, because absence of interruption had become part of the final architecture of understanding. The child remained steady beside Ethan, his gaze moving between the adults in a slow and deliberate rhythm, not reacting emotionally, but observing with a calm consistency that reinforced his position as a fixed point within the unfolding alignment of truth. Ethan slowly turned his head towards Sophie, and when he spoke, his voice carried a calm finality that no longer engaged with interpretation, but instead confirmed internal completion and the effect of. That tone moved through the room not as surprise, but as recognition, because what he expressed aligned with what had already been understood collectively without needing articulation. Sophie's expression tightened briefly, not in visible collapse, but in controlled awareness that the structure she had been operating within had fully dissolved, and her gaze flickered once toward the child before returning to Ethan, as if searching for a remaining point of stability within a situation that no longer offered any structural support. Ethan took a slow step forward into the center aisle, not as confrontation but as alignment, and that movement subtly redefined the emotional center of the room, drawing all attention into a single axis that included him, Sophie, and the child in a configuration that no longer allowed ambiguity to exist. The officiant remained motionless near the front, fully withdrawn from any attempt to guide or interpret proceedings, because ceremony itself had already been replaced by consequence, while the guests remained seated in absolute silence, their attention unified and fixed not in anticipation but in recognition that the moment had already reached completion. Sophie attempted to speak again, her tone measured but now carrying visible strain, and although her words remained structured, they no longer carried influence over interpretation, because understanding had already moved beyond individual control and into collective recognition that no longer required validation. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression steady and unchanged, and as she continued speaking, the difference between explanation and resistance became increasingly clear, not through emotional intensity, but through diminishing structural authority over the room's awareness. The child shifted his stance slightly, still not speaking, but his presence remained central not through action but through alignment, and in that alignment, there was a quiet inevitability that extended beyond the immediate exchange and into the full emotional structure of the scene. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly toward the casket once more, and in that moment the emotional axis of the cathedral recentered itself around absence rather than confrontation, reinforcing that what was unfolding was not discovery, but acknowledgement of something that had already existed beneath silence long before any of them became aware of it. Sophie followed his gaze briefly before returning forward, and in that shared orientation there was an unspoken recognition that past and present had fully merged within this moment, removing any remaining separation between memory and immediate reality. Ethan exhaled slowly, not as emotional release, but as completion of internal alignment, and when he spoke again his tone carried finality that did not invite continuation, but instead marked closure of uncertainty, shifting the entire room into collective recognition rather than ongoing interpretation. Sophie's reaction remained restrained but unmistakable, her expression tightening briefly before settling into stillness that no longer attempted to assert control. And in that stillness, there was acceptance that further resistance would not alter what had already been fully established within the structure of understanding around them. The child remained near Ethan, no longer central through movement but through alignment, and Ethan looked down at him once more with calm acknowledgement that required no verbal confirmation because recognition had already been fully completed through presence alone. Sophie lowered her gaze slightly for the first time in a sustained way, not in collapse, but in recognition of position within a structure that no longer functioned according to her intent. And when she lifted it again, there was no longer certainty guiding her expression, only quiet restraint shaped by awareness of irreversible understanding. Ethan turned his attention fully towards Sophie, and the silence that followed carried more weight than any additional statement, because it marked the point at which dialogue had fully transitioned into recognition without need for explanation, and Sophie did not respond immediately, allowing the silence itself to complete the final transition of meaning. The guests remained completely still, their collective awareness now unified around the understanding that nothing further needed to be said for meaning to be complete, because clarity had already replaced uncertainty, and had settled permanently into the structure of the room. Ethan finally spoke once more, his tone unchanged but carrying undeniable finality, and the effect was immediate, not through reaction but through alignment. As if the cathedral itself had already reached the same conclusion and was only now acknowledging it collectively within shared silence. Sophie stood in stillness with composed posture that no longer projected authority. Ethan remained steady at the front with the child beside him, both positioned within a final alignment that suggested no further disruption would follow, because everything necessary to be understood had already been fully established within the silence that now defined the entire cathedral. And in that final state of recognition, the room no longer waited for anything to happen, because everything that needed to be revealed had already been fully seen, fully understood, and fully accepted within the permanence of what remained. The cathedral no longer felt like a place holding a ceremony, but instead felt like a space where time itself had slowed down to the point of absolute clarity, and Ethan Caldwell stood at the front aisle with the child still beside him, while Sophie Lane remained several steps behind, her presence now reduced to a quiet stillness that no longer carried authority or resistance, because everything that had defined tension earlier had already dissolved into full recognition within the room. And Ethan's gaze remained steady toward the casket where Lillian Hart rested, unseen, yet still central to the emotional gravity that had shaped every moment of what had unfolded. And in that sustained silence there was no longer anticipation or uncertainty, only the final phase of understanding that required no further explanation. The guests remained completely motionless, their attention unified in a state of acceptance that had replaced all earlier curiosity, because what they had witnessed was no longer developing but fully formed in meaning, and even the faintest movement felt unnecessary against the weight of what had already been acknowledged. Sophie finally shifted slightly, not stepping forward but lowering her shoulders just enough to reflect the absence of control she had once maintained, and when she spoke this time her voice carried no attempt to assert direction, only a quiet acknowledgement that the structure she had operated within no longer existed in the way she had believed it did. And Ethan did not interrupt her, allowing the words to settle completely into silence before responding, because the silence itself had already become part of the resolution. The child remained steady beside Ethan, his small presence unchanged, but now fully integrated into the center of emotional understanding within the room. And when Ethan finally lowered his gaze toward him, there was no question or hesitation in his expression, only recognition that had already completed itself internally long before it was acknowledged outwardly. And that recognition shifted the entire emotional structure of the space without requiring any spoken declaration. Sophie's gaze briefly moved toward the child again, then back to Ethan. And in that movement, there was a visible realization that whatever structure she had been attempting to maintain had fully dissolved into something she could no longer influence or reshape, because the meaning of everything present had already stabilized without her involvement. Ethan took a slow step forward into the center aisle, not as confrontation, but as completion of alignment, and that single movement redefined the emotional center of the room once more, drawing all remaining attention into a single axis where nothing remained uncertain or unresolved. And the guests remained silent, no longer reacting but fully absorbing the final shape of what had been revealed. The officiant stood still near the front, no longer attempting to participate in the structure of ceremony, because there was nothing left to guide or interpret, only the quiet acknowledgement that the purpose of the gathering had already shifted beyond its original definition. Sophie attempted one final time to speak, her tone controlled but now lacking structural authority, and, although her words were still composed, they no longer shaped interpretation, because interpretation had already been completed collectively within the silence that filled the cathedral. Ethan listened without interruption, his expression unchanged and steady, and as she finished speaking there was no response immediately because none was required, since what had been understood no longer needed confirmation to remain complete. The child shifted his stance slightly, then returned to stillness, his presence remaining constant and centered within the emotional architecture of the room. And in that stillness, there was a sense of closure that extended beyond individuals and into the structure of meaning itself. Ethan finally turned his attention fully towards Sophie, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain but absolute, because it marked the final point at which dialogue no longer functioned as exchange, but instead existed only as acknowledgement of what had already been fully understood. Sophie lowered her gaze for a sustained moment, not in collapse, but in quiet acceptance of position within a structure that no longer responded to her intent. And when she lifted it again, there was no remaining certainty, only recognition that the framework she had entered with no longer existed in any functional form. Ethan turned once more toward the casket, and in doing so re-centered the emotional axis of the cathedral around absence, reinforcing that what had unfolded was not discovery, but full realization of something that had always been present beneath silence. And the guests remained completely still, their collective awareness now unified in understanding that no further explanation was necessary because everything essential had already been revealed. Sophie stood quietly for a final moment, her posture composed, but no longer projecting control, and then she slowly stepped back, not dramatically, not abruptly, but with a quiet withdrawal that reflected acknowledgement rather than resistance. And as she moved away from the center aisle, her presence diminished within the emotional structure of the room until it no longer influenced its balance. Ethan remained steady at the front with the child beside him, both positioned within a final alignment that no longer required confirmation or reaction from others, because everything that needed to be understood had already been fully established, and the cathedral itself felt as though it had completed its purpose, holding only silence now not as absence but as permanence, while the guests remained seated in quiet stillness, not waiting for anything further, because there was nothing left to arrive, nothing left to reveal, and nothing left to change within the final recognition that had already fully settled into the space and into every